Chapter The Dress. The Bureau. Ron? Breathed Harry, who sat up and grabbed the bars of his cage so he could get a better look. Then suddenly, Aunt Petunia's prized Juliet Rose flower pot came smashing through the window. Harry braced himself and listened for any stirring upstairs. There was nothing. It must have been 4 a.m. and everyone was in their very deep sleep. Ron poked his head in the small 2-by-3-foot opening where the basement window used to be. "I'm Ron Weasley, I'm here to rescue you." "That's all fine and dandy, Ron, but how? I'm trapped in this cage." "What the dash?" Ron slithered his way through the window and dropped down to the floor. "All right, Harry?" asked George, poking his head in the window now. "What's been going on?" said Ron as he approached the cage. "Why haven't you been answering my letters? I've asked you to stay about 12 times. But I haven't gotten any letters. I've been waiting all summer for you people to write me. You'd think I'd get at least some fan mail, but nothing." "That's so? Well, perhaps my dad can look into it. He works for the ministry, you know," said Ron. "Lot of that stuff is need to know and private matters and such. But Dad doesn't really stick to those bounds and knows how to snoop around. We'll ask when we get back." "Here, Ron," said George as he lowered down a triangle flag rope. Ron took it and walked over to Harry's cage and tied it around one of the bars. "How is this rescue going to work exactly?" inquired Harry. "We're going to pull you out. Dad put an ever-strong charm on this flag rope he got at Party City so it won't ever break, no matter how much force we use. Plan is to just pull you out of the window there." Said Harry, "you do realize that the window is far too small for this here cage to go through, don't you?" Ron just grinned. "And all my Hogwarts stuff, my wand, my broomstick, my trunk of necessities, toiletries and unmentionables." "Where is it?" "Should be in the shed across the lawn. I think my pig is there too, if it's still alive. Haven't fed her in weeks." "No problemo," said George, who minutes later came back and said, "We got it, all of it. Even the pig, barely alive, but we think it'll make it. All ready to go now. Come on, Ron, upsy daisy." "Don't worry," said Ron, "hold on tight." Harry moved to the back of the cage and gripped the bars behind his head. Ron climbed up the flag rope and out the window. There was a revving noise outside and became louder and suddenly, with a sudden jerk, the cage flew up into the basement window with a loud bang. Of course the cage was far too big and Harry, who did not die from the intense G-forces, wondered what trick they had up their sleeve to get him over this one last obstacle. But as the loud revving noise grew even louder, there came sudden scampering of feet from upstairs. And soon, the basement stair light clicked on and down came a scampering Uncle Vern. For a split second, Uncle Vern stood at the bottom of the staircase staring up at Harry's cage. At that same instant there came another loud crack as the concrete foundation began to split. Just as Uncle Vern jumped to grab hold of the cage, the entire structure burst upward and out in an explosion of dirt and shattered concrete that destroyed most of that side of the house. The cage flew up and away. Harry could hear Uncle Vern screaming as his voice faded into the distant below. "Petunia!" roared Uncle Vern, his fists shaking at the sky. "He's getting away. He's making a break for IT." Harry couldn't believe it. He was free. Free. The cool night air whizzing against his face let him know that he was still alive. He looked down and saw the shrinking rooftops of the private drive and soon the town itself. "See you next summer," he yelled back. Harry, who was still curious on how this magnificent feat was achieved, looked up. But all he could see apart from the flag rope that went up into the blackness of the night sky were a number of blinking green lights surrounded by 4 bright white ones. They flew along the countryside for what seemed like ages. It also seemed to Harry that they kept doubling back for some reason. Perhaps they were lost? No matter, Eventually Harry landed with a thud in a grassy field. And soon the contraption that was used in his daring escape had landed next to him too. Gull-wing doors opened and out stepped Ron and his older twin brothers Fred and George. Harry gawked. Wait a minute, Ron," Harry said bewildered. "Are you telling me you built a flying car, out of a DeLorean? Dad always said if you're going to do something, why not do it with some style?" Fred jumped in. "Besides, the stainless steel construction is an excellent magic conductor it turns out. Funny thing that, Dad spotted the shiny stainless steel in the forest one day on a stroll. Turns out it was this here automobile, abandoned. So he took it upon himself to restore it with a few modifications of his own, of course." Harry just gazed at the vehicle as Fred and George went to work on freeing Harry from his cage. Moments later, "What does your dad do, anyway?" said Harry. "I don't think you ever mentioned it last year." "Pretty sure I did, loads of times. He works at the Ministry of Magic in the most important department," said Ron. "The exploitation of mole relics office." "The what?" "It's all about bewitching mole-made stuff, you know, so we can keep tabs on them. Like, a couple of years ago, the ministry sold an old lady a tea set out of an antiques shop. This mole woman took it home and served it to her friends. The ministry learned all sorts of juicy gossip. Quite the stories. I'll have Dad tell you some. He was promoted because of it. Now they say about 7 out of 10 moles have some sort of object with a listening charm on it." The Weasleys all roared with laughter, but Harry didn't really know what to make of it. He just played along and grinned ear to ear as he made a mental note to look up an anti-listening spell. "Why don't you let Pigwiggy out?" he told Ron. "She hasn't had a chance to stretch her wings for ages, stuffed in her cage for longer than I've been in mine, practically since the time we got back from Hogwarts." George handed a hairpin to Fred and, a moment later, Pigwiggy flew euphorically up and around in circles and then disappeared over a grouping of treetops, as of course all pigs in the wizarding world have invisible wings. "Ah. She'll come back, right?" Harry asked. There was no response. The hairpin was passed back to George so he could continue picking the lock on Harry's cage. "Yeah, probably," said Ron eventually. "So, what's the story, Harry? What's been happening with you? How'd you end up in this here cage?" Harry told them all about the chores he's done since he came back from school, the mysterious Abu Dhabi, the dire warning he bestowed upon Harry and the debacle that was Sir Branson's dinner. There was an extensive, pondering silence when he had finished, until, click. "Aha! Finally," said George at last. The lock on Harry's cage sprang open. "That's unquestionably dodgy," said George. "So he wouldn't even tell you who's hypothetically plotting all this stuff? Come on." "I don't think he could," said Harry. "I told you. Every time he got close to letting something slip, he started banging his head with that pot." Harry stepped out of his cage at last and gave a long hard stretch, stomach protruding outwards as he stuck his hands up and back. Fred and George looked at each other, a perplexed look on their faces. "What? I haven't stretched in days," said Harry. "Never mind that now, never mind that now, not now, not now, not now," said Fred. "Anyway, let's put it this way, house elves have got commanding magic of their own, but they normally can't usually use it without their master's expressed written consent. It's in their sacred oath somewhere, I think. And you know how oaths are these days, you break one word of an oral contract and the lawyers would be all over you faster than you can say the full name of Platform E. I reckon this Darby character was sent to stop you coming back to Hogwarts. Someone's idea of a jest. I mean really, you're Harry the Slayer Potter. Do you really think anything can happen to you? Especially at Hogwarts surrounded by your many fans? I mean there's got to be 24 or so kids at least who will gladly take a spell for you. Is there anyone at school with a grudge against you?" Yes, said Harry and Ron together, instantly. Snape, Harry explained. He hates me. Professor Snape, said George, walking around Harry. Evil, yes. But if anything, he'd want you to come back so he could torment you in his classes more. Seems to get off on that sort of thing. What about Lucius Malfoy? Who? As in Draco Malfoy's dad? Harry questioned. Yeah, I've overheard Dad grumble on about Lucius dozens of times, said George. Sounds like one bad dude, and one who would be out to get you, let me tells you. He was a big supporter of you, know perfectly well who I'm talking about. And after you did your thing and you know perfectly well who I'm talking about vanished, said Fred, walking around to look at Harry. Lucius Malfoy came back from the Slavers' hold saying he never meant any of it. See, Lucius was the one who beat all the slaves that you know perfectly well who I'm talking about took as prisoners. Claimed he was under a spell the whole time. Poppycock, Dad has it on good authority that he was right, and you know perfectly well who I'm talking about's inner circle. Course, he's rich. Was able to afford a whole horde of lawyers to get him off the hook of everything. Although rumor has it that he's only wealthy because he was the one behind you know perfectly well who I'm talking about's lost train of gold that disappeared the same time the big guy did. It was carrying all the treasures, most of it gold, from people you perfectly well who I'm talking about conquered over the years. It was known to exist but has never been found. Awfully suspicious how someone from the poorest of wizarding families suddenly becomes the richest practically overnight. Harry had heard these rumors about Malfoy's family before, and they didn't surprise him at all. Nevertheless, if the opportune moment were to present itself to steal a whole train of gold, Harry would have done the same thing. But Draco Malfoy, son of Lucius Malfoy, was his good friend and was an inquisitive, thoughtful, sensitive boy. Just like him. Draco never really talked much about his family though, the subject just never came up. However, he did strangely like to inform Harry of their whereabouts for some reason. I don't know whether the Malfoys own a house elf, said Harry. Well, whoever owns him will be an old wizarding family, and they'll be rich, said Fred with a wink. Yeah, Mum's always wishing we had a house elf to do all the chores and everything, said George. But all we've got is a lazy old ghoul in the attic and gnomes all over the garden. They do more harm than good, let me tells you. House elves only want to work for the rich at broken down old manors and drafty castles and places like that. You wouldn't catch one in our house. Didn't the Malfoys buy that old Downton place? Harry was silent. Judging by the fact that Draco Malfoy usually had the best of everything like Harry, it was clear that Draco's family was rolling in wizard gold, dare he even say, trainloads. He could just picture Malfoy strutting around a large mansion wearing his enormous "The Dark Side Shall Rise Again" belt buckle. If his dad was all buddy-buddy with the V-Man, sending the family servant to stop Harry from going back to Hogwarts would have naturally been a way to get sweet revenge on the kid who ended the good thing they had going. Or was Harry just stupid to take Abu Dhabi seriously? I'm glad we came to get you, anyway, said Ron. I was getting really bored around here. When you didn't reply to any of my letters, I thought it was Ernest's doing at first. Who's Ernest? Oh, our good-for-nothing pig. He's ancient. It wouldn't be the first time he'd blundered deliveries. So then I tried to borrow Hillary. Who? The pig Mum and Dad gifted Percy when they made him perfect, said Fred. But Percy wouldn't lend her to me, said Ron. Said he needed her, whatever that meant. Percy's been acting odd this whole summer, said George, frowning. He's been spending loads of time shut up in his room with that pig. I mean, there's only so many times you can polish a perfect badge, if you know what I mean, he added with a wink. Harry didn't. So, does your dad know you've got this DeLorean? Said Harry, predicting the answer. No, said Ron, he had to work late tonight. With any luck we'll be able to get it back in the barn without Mum noticing we flew it. "That's the main road," said George, pointing across the small grassy field. "We're 2 miles away from town. Can't fly all the way in, someone's bound to notice. Just as well, here comes the sun, do-do-do-do." A dim rosy radiance was noticeable along the skyline. Fred went around to the driver's seat, and Harry and the others crammed in from the other side. DeLoreans only had 2 front seats. Fred turned the ignition. Nothing happened. He tried again, still nothing but the faint clicks of the electronics going on and off. "Dad always said he had problems with the starter," George said. Fred banged his head on the steering wheel in frustration. The engine suddenly roared to life. Fred laughed and shifted into gear. The DeLorean bolted across the field and sped off into the sunrise. Moments later they were rumbling up a gravel road towards the Weasleys' family abode. As they steered towards a collapsing old wooden barn, Harry gazed upon Ron's house for the first time. But it wasn't really a house, more like a shantytown. It looked as though it had been built on what was once a garbage dump, smelled like it too. There was a collection of little tin-covered buildings that dotted the mound of dirt and grass upon which they sat. One building in the middle appeared to be about 3 stories, though this was the ricketiest and grittiest one of the lot. It was clear that extra rooms had been added over time and violated more building codes than Harry could probably count. Fred pulled up and backed the DeLorean into the barn, which was a decent walk from the rest of the structures. As Harry got out of the car and looked around, the barn looked like it had seen better days, and he was surprised it was even still standing at all. It looked as though it were held up by magic, which Harry later thought, hey, it probably was. "Quick! Let's cover the DeLorean," George stated as he grabbed a beige tarp. Fred closed the barn door and the gang waddled on up towards the main area of structures. A lopsided rusty time-worn sign on an archway read, "The Bureau." Trash was scattered everywhere. Everything from corroded old bikes and other hunks of metal Harry couldn't make out to robes and garments to your average family elephant stand were spread around the lawn. Several fat brown chickens were pecking their way around the yard at old fast food wrappers. Either this place was in fact built on a garbage heap, or these people were the trashiest people Harry ever met. Perhaps it was a little of both. I know, it's rubbish," said Ron. "It's wonderful," said Harry happily, now knowing that Ron lived here. "Now, we'll go into our shanties real quiet like," said Fred, "and wait for Mum to sound the alarm for breakfast. Then, Ron, you come prancing across the yard saying, 'Mum, look who hitchhiked his way here.' And she'll be so pleased as punch to see Harry, and no one be none the wiser that we borrow the DeLorean." "Right," said Ron. "Come on, Harry, I sleep in that one." Ron had pointed to a sad little hut in the back corner of the lawn. But just as he did, he put on a sad little face that mimicked how the shack must have felt. Mrs. Weasley was trooping across the yard, scattering chickens and causing trash to blow in her wake. For a short, plump, oddly-faced woman, it was incredible how much she looked like a Tyrannosaurus Rex ready for a kill. "Well, boys, the jig is up," said Fred. Mrs. Weasley came to a halt in front of them, pounding the rolling pin she carried with her, glaring from one guilty face to the next. She was wearing a light pink apron that said 99 problems, but a snitch ain't one, with a one sticking out of one of its pockets. "So she demanded. "Top o' the morning to ya," said George, in what he clearly thought was a normal response. "Have you any idea how nervous I've been?" said Mrs. Weasley in a deadly yell. "I have it in my mind to beat every last one of you with this here rolling pin." "Sorry, Mum, but see, we figured we had to." All 3 of Mrs. Weasley's sons were loftier than she was, but they still cowered in fear as her rage broke them. To Harry it was clear that she had beaten them many times over before. Shanty's empty. No memo. DeLorean gone, could have crashed and died, going out of my mind with worry. Did you care? Never, so long as you live. Just wait until your father gets home. We never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or our perfect Percy. Dad never came home? Mumbled Fred, sounding half worried, half confused. You could do with a bit of reading out of Percy's book, yelled Mrs. Weasley, poking a finger in Fred's chest with every word. That boy's been perfect. But you lot, you could have died, you could have been seen, you could have lost your father his job. It seemed to go on for hours. Mrs. Weasley had shouted herself tremendously hoarse before she turned to Harry, who thought about just bolting off into the yonder woods. "It's a pleasure to see you, Harry dear," she said. "Come in and have summer lunch." It was now 2:30 in the afternoon. She turned and walked back into the main shanty, and Harry, after a nervous glance at Ron who nodded with that "you better do it" look, followed her. The kitchen was exceptionally small and very cramped. There was an old scuffed-up wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Harry slouched down onto the biggest seat he could find that wasn't broken and looked around. He had never been in a wizard house before and wondered if they were all like this. The clock on the wall opposite him had only one hand and no numbers at all. Written around the edge were things like time to wake up, time to go to the bathroom, time to panic, time to save an ancient species, time to party, time to die, and you're late, stupid. Books were stacked higher than Harry, sometimes 12 deep, books with titles like Charm Your Crush Whether They Like It or Not, Deadly Baking Enchantments, and 1-Minute Disease Cures, It's Magic. And unless Harry's ears were deceiving him, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching Hour, with the popular sorceress, Elvira Mistress of the Dark. Mrs. Weasley was clattering around, cooking lunch haphazardly, throwing dirty looks at her sons as she threw several pounds of taco meat into the frying pan. Every now and then she muttered things like "Don't know why wizards love these tacos so much, and never would have caught me eating this mole food back in my day." "I don't blame you, dear," she assured Harry, passing 8 or 9 taco shells onto his plate. "Just because you lived with moles doesn't mean you picked up their eating habits. But my boys love these tacos, and it's the latest craze sweeping our kind. Oh, and Arthur and I have been worried about you, too. Just last week we were saying we'd come and get you ourselves if you hadn't written back to Ron by 4 Fridays from now." But really, she was now adding a pile of taco meat to his plate, flying an illegal car halfway across the country. "Anyone could have seen you, should have checked the local papers." She flicked her wand casually and said, "Rubbidi scrubbidi sweepity flow." The dirty pots she had been cooking with flew into the sink, which began to clean themselves, clinking together. "It was cloudy, Mum," said Fred with a mouthful of taco. "You keep your trap shut while you're eating," Mrs. Weasley cracked. "They were starving him, Mum," said George. "In a cage and everything." "And you," said Mrs. Weasley. At that moment there was a diversion in the form of a small, red-headed figure wearing the skimpiest of bikinis which emerged in the kitchen doorway, gave a small squeal, and ran out as fast as she appeared. "Ginny," said Ron in an undertone to Harry. "My sister. She's been talking about you all summer. Not sure why she wasn't wearing anything, that was strange." "Yeah, bet she'll be wanting you, Harry," Fred said with a large grin, but he caught his mother's eye and bent his face over his plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 4 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly long time due to the amount of taco meat that had to be consumed. "Blimey, I'm tired," yawned Fred, setting down his napkin at last more than an hour later. "I think I'll go to bed and—" "You will absolutely not," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "It's not my fault you've been up all night. You're going to denome the garden for me, they're getting totally out of hand again." "Oh, Mum. And you too," she said, glaring at Ron and George. "Clean out his septic tank, it's full again. You can go to bed, dear," she added to Harry. You didn't ask them to fly you in that wreck of a car. But Harry, who did feel wide awake, said quickly, "Okay, thanks. Now, let's see what the Kingslayer's got to say on the subject," Mrs. Weasley said, turning to the pile of books. And she pulled a heavy book from the top of the stack, making Harry think she referenced it often. George, Fred and Ron all groaned in unison. "Mum, we know how to do our jobs, you make us do it all the time." Harry looked at their all-red cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words "Dirty Jobs with Jaime Lannister." There was a big photograph on the front of an extremely handsome man with bright green eyes and wavy hair like spun gold. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Jaime Lannister, kept winking flirtatiously up at them all. Mrs. Weasley smiled down at him with a loving sigh. "Oh, he's just marvelous," she said. "He knows his dirty jobs, all right, it's a delightful read." "Mum fancies him," said Fred, in a very loud whisper. "That's preposterous, Fred. I love your father oh so very much," said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink and eyes became rather twitchy. All right, if you think you know better than Lannister, you can go and get on with it, but woe is you if there's a single gnome in that garden when I come out to inspect your handiwork." Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slumped outside while Harry made a beeline for the guest shanty he was pointed to. He got a good look at the garden on his walk over, which was large. There were plenty of weeds. The grass was in gross need of cutting, odd statues and busts dotted throughout, and just everything seemed overgrown. He also got a good view of the septic tank which seemed to be overflowing. "Miles of garden gnomes, too, you know," Harry told Ron. They crossed the lawn. "Yeah, I've seen those statues you call gnomes," said Ron, "like fat little Santa Clauses with signs that say leave or go away." Just then there was a violent scuffling noise coming from within the garden on the other side of the split rail fence. Ron straightened up. "Get ready, Harry." Just then, a tiny little man came running out towards them from behind the overgrown grass. Ron reached down and snagged it by its belt, picking him up. "This is a gnome," he said grimly. "Get off me! Get off me!" squealed the gnome, fighting and twisting his arms around. It was certainly just like Santa Claus. It was small and had a pointed white beard with a large, red pointy hat. Ron held it at arm's length as it kicked out at him with its tiny little feet. He grasped it around the ankles and turned it upside down. "This is what you have to do," he said. He held the gnome at arm's length and drop-kicked him back into the garden. A small stream of blood and guts spluttered across some bushes. Seeing the shocked look on Harry's face, Ron added, "It doesn't hurt them. They're pretty much killed instantly." More rumblings in the bushes, this time a lot more violently. "Blimey, they're everywhere. Must be breeding like rats," Ron stated. A short punchy female gnome ran out towards them now, her pants down near her ankles. Another gnome, this time male, came after her, arms out. His pants down at the end of his tiny little feet too. Because of this, they couldn't move very fast and was easy pickings for Ron, who kicked the male's head clean off. Harry asked if he could do the female and Ron nodded. "Wow, Harry, that must have been 50 feet. All right, I'll take it from here. You guys got septic duty," said Fred, talking to Ron and George. The air was soon thick with flying gnome guts, and as if this wasn't bad enough, so was the smell from the septic tank. Harry retreated to the guest shack to get out of the hot sun. But the smell was driving him mad and couldn't get any sleep, as he was starting to hit the wall. The uncomfortable bed made out of lumpy old pillows wasn't helping either. Just then, the front door slammed. "He's back," said George. "Dad's home." Harry heard through the thin tin siding. He poked his head out of the shack to see what was going on and Ron waved him over. They sped swiftly through the garden and back into the main domicile. Mr. Weasley was slouched in a kitchen chair, exhausted, a bottle of brandy already in his hand. He was a flimsy man, already bald, but what little hair he still had was as Red Riding's coat. He was wearing long green robes, which were very dusty and travel-worn. "What a night," he murmured, taking a large swig from his bottle as they all sat down around him. 9 stings. 9? And old Mundungus Fletcher even put a hex on me when I had my back turned. Thought it would make for a good laugh to give me a tail. Well, I ain't laughing." Mr. Weasley took another long gulp and sighed. "Find anything out, Dad?" said Fred eagerly. "We used their pets against them this time. Nothing as of yet, but if anything comes up we should hear something through the twilight bark. It's this nifty new network we've set up. Stephen in accounting thought of it. Brilliant idea, really. All the moles will hear is barking, barking and more barking, which will be passed along all the way to the ministry. But once we translate the code, we'll know all their mole secrets," yawned Mr. Weasley. "There was some pretty nasty stuff that wasn't my department, though. Mortlake was taken away for questioning about some extremely odd ferrets, but that's the Committee on Experimental Charms, thank goodness." "Why would anyone bother telling their dog their secrets?" said George. "You'd be surprised," sighed Mr. Weasley. "These moles aren't exactly the brightest race, you see. They talk to their pets loads of times, telling them everything. And the ministry will eat it all up. But I tell you, it's been too successful of a program. A few more nights like this and it'll kill me." "Oh no, it won't." Mrs. Weasley had butted in with a very stern look upon her face. Mr. Weasley's eyes jerked around. He stared in bewilderment at his wife. What's that, Molly dear?" "Yes, Arthur, you," said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes flashing. "You can't die yet, look how many mouths we still need to feed. And by Voldemort's beard." Everyone at the table winced at this, except for Harry of course. "I'm not going to be getting a real job anytime soon. So until Ginny's out of school I forbid you from dying. Is that clear?" Mr. Weasley blinked. "Well, dear, I think you'll find that, yes, I still have a few more years left in me, anyway." "Arthur Weasley, you better make sure that you do," shouted Mrs. Weasley. "If only just so you can carry on tinkering with all that mold rubbish in your shed. And by the way, Harry arrived this morning in that flying DeLorean of yours." "Harry?" said Mr. Weasley blankly. "Harry who?" He panned around his room, saw Harry, and leapt. "Oh my, is this the famous Harry Potter? Sorry, I thought you were Percy. Can't keep track of all these kids. Anyway, very content to meet you. Ronald's told us so much about you, won't stop going on about it really. Your sons flew the tin can of a car to Harry's house and back last night," yelled Mrs. Weasley. "What have you got to say about that, eh?" "Oh? Well, I was hoping that old hover conversion charm really turned that baby into a skyway flyer," said Mr. Weasley eagerly. "Never taken it on that long of a journey before myself. Seems they made it back all right. Where do you live again, Harry? Kent is it?" "Ball's Cross, sir," Harry replied. "Ah, that's right. Well," he paused as he felt the sharpest of stares from Mrs. Weasley's beady white fiery eyes, that was very incorrect of you, boys, very incorrect. Let's slip out the back, this can go on for hours again," Ron whispered to Harry as Mrs. Weasley swelled like a puffy sponge. "Come on, I'll show you my shanty room." They slipped out the back of the kitchen and down a narrow passageway to a tiny little door that to Harry seemed like a fire hazard. After some initial struggle getting through the small opening, both made their way across the lawn towards a little hut in the back. But just as Harry strolled past the last shanty before Ron's, he just caught sight of a pair of legs that seemed to go on for days. Then soon, a tiny bikini bottom, followed by an even tinier bikini top. And finally, the red hair of the girl who wandered into the kitchen earlier. She appeared to be fast asleep, laid out on a rusty old lawn chair. "Well, well, well, what do we have here?" proclaimed Harry, intrigued. "Ginny," said Ron. "You don't know how weird it is for her to be sunbathing like this. Normally she hates the sun. Dad thinks there may be some vampire blood in her or something. Come on, leave her be." Harry started walking forward again, but his head wasn't facing that direction. But soon they reached a door that was hastily attached to some tin siding and a tin roof that looked like it would blow off with the slightest breeze. This must be enchanted too, Harry thought, as there was no way this would withstand the force of nature for very long. Along the top of the door with peeling paint was a small plaque that read, "Ronald's Palace." Harry stepped inside, his head almost touching the sloping ceiling, and blinked. It was like walking into a makeover, home edition nightmare. Every single inch of Ron's hut was covered in a ferocious shade of orange. The bedspread, the walls, even the ceiling and floor. Then Harry realized that Ron had covered nearly every inch of the shabby walls with posters of the same 7 witches and wizards, all wearing bright orange robes, carrying broomsticks, and waving energetically. "Your Quidditch team?" said Harry. "The chubby crayons," Ron said with a sigh, pointing at the orange bedspread, which was emblazoned with 2 giant black C's and a big thick orange crane coming out of the middle. "Dead last in the league." Ron's school spell books were thrown uncaringly in a corner, next to a pile of newspapers that all seemed to feature the misadventures of Maniac Miggs, the Mad Mole. Ron's magic wand was lying on top of a pile of very dirty clothes which were next to his big fat rat, Scabbers, who was snoozing in a patch of sun that came through the roof. Harry actually didn't see Scabbers and stepped right on top of him as he crossed the room to get another angled view of what lay before him. Scabbers squeaked with a loud whimper and retreated to a dark corner with a hard limp when it was all over, not to be seen again for some time. Harry meanwhile turned and looked out the only window, which seemed more like a rusty old hole more than anything. In the field across the way he could see a gang of gnomes huddled together around a large piece of parchment that must have had their revenge plan. Then he turned to look at Ron, who was watching him most nervously, as though waiting for his opinion. "It's a bit small," Harry said quickly. "Well, I only moved out here because my old room in the main house was right underneath the ghoul in the attic. He was always banging his lady friends and groaning." But Harry, grinning widely, said, "That would have been marvelous to live under. Unlike my current place, always hearing Uncle Vern and Bubba stomping about." Ron blushed.